You want to make your pup the perfect cozy sweatshirt, but they never seem to fit right. They either don't come big enough for your dog's size, or they turn into the dreaded crop top if they do, or you have a specialized breed that has very specific dimensions that doesn't fit into standardized clothing. We've all been there. I have a half dachshund mix myself, so I totally understand the struggle of too short legs and super long body and barrel chested. The Kaleido hoodie is here to change that. It is fast, it is easy, beginner friendly, and it is designed to be customizable to fit for a dog of any size or breed, or even a cat, so they can finally have the cozy sweatshirt of their dreams. Hi, if you're new here, I'm Nicole. I am the designer behind Hudson Houndstooth. I have over 20 years of experience in design and pattern making, and it has been my mission to create functional, stylish, and properly fitting clothing for your fur babies. If that sounds like something you'd be interested, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future tutorials from me. When I designed the Kaleido hoodie, I wanted to put my own spin on the classic hoodie. I wanted something that was both timeless but also had a fun, creative little twist. I was inspired by patchwork hoodies and quilted jackets that are super on trend right now, but also are a great creative way to use leftover fabric and fabric scraps, which, let's be honest, we're all hoarding our fabric scraps, are we not? This pattern gives you creative freedom while also being a quick and easy sew. I'm gonna walk you through step by step on how to make this on both a serger and a sewing machine, so even if you don't have a serger, you can still do this project. Or if you're brand new to serging and you're intimidated, I will also give you some helpful tips on how to make the serger more comfortable for you. In this tutorial, I'm actually going to make 2 samples that I will walk you through how to make step by step the pattern on both a serger and a regular home machine, so even if you don't have a serger, you can absolutely do this project. And I'll walk you through all of the various different options that go along, because if you know me, you'll know that I love options, and this pattern is no exception. There's 3 different necklines along with a bonus 4th option, and 2 different hemlines, so that even if you have a barrel chested dog that struggles with getting the snatched looking waist, got you covered, as well as some optional details that you can choose to add or subtract, like a patch pocket on the back and a harness opening. So I will cover all of those options in this tutorial, again along with the serger and the sewing machine, so you can pick and choose whichever options fit best for you. So whether you're brand new to sewing knits or you're just looking to build your skills, this pattern is for you. It also gives you the option to experiment with quilting without the commitment of making a whole quilt. And trust me, the quilting is super beginner friendly because I myself am not a quilter. If you are an expert quilter, please don't judge me. Just know that I will cover very easy quilting options for this project. And lastly, if you have ever struggled to fit clothing on your pups or your cat, this is going to be the biggest game changer of them all. In this pattern, not only are there 15 base sizes to fit dogs anywhere from under 5 pounds up to 200 plus. One of our pattern testers was a newfie. But not only are there 15 base sizes, but I have over 10 pages of detailed instructions on common fit issues with photographs and explanations of how to identify what exactly is not fitting on your pup's garment and how to adjust the pattern to get it so that it does fit, so you can confidently tweak and adjust to have the perfectly fitting sweatshirt for your fur baby. This means this is not just a pattern. This is a resource that you can use for any clothing that you make your fur baby. If you haven't already, grab the Kaleido hoodie pattern at the link in the description, and then we will move on to how to pick the right fabric and getting started. Okay, let's talk about the fabrics that you're gonna need for this project. If you're brand new to knits, don't worry, I got you. Basically, the most basic of basic knits is going to be jersey, which is what my t-shirt fabric is. Basically, all that knit fabrics are is a series of loops, and the front side of those loops are known as knit stitches, and they look like little V's, and then the back side are called purl stitches, and they look like loops. For the fabrics that I recommend, main body of this fabric is either French terry or fleece. And French terry is basically you take that jersey fabric fabric, and then you're going to add a secondary yarn across the back that gets looped in every couple of stitches and has like these floating strands that kind of alternate, and that creates that quintessential loop texture that you see on the back of French terry. Now when you take those loops, that secondary yarn, and you brush it and make it fuzzy, that's how you get fleece. Now part of the nature of fleece is that the fuzzy texture will make that fabric feel thicker than the French terry, even though technically the yarn and the weight and everything is the exact same. That texture adds kind of a loftiness to, so it will tend to feel thicker. And also the little fuzzy threads also help trap that air from that warm air from your body better, and so it has a tendency to feel warmer, which is why you typically find French terry in more spring summer months and the fleece more in fall winter. It's also very, very soft. Either one works, it's all up to you, and I recommend about 30% stretch. If you have no idea what your fabric is, I'm going to show you how to figure that out in just a minute. And then for the cuffs and bands, I recommend rib. Now I either recommend a 1x1 rib or a 2x2 rib. What that means is 1x1 just means one knit stitch followed by one purl stitch and then alternate back and forth. 2x2 is 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches, again alternating back. The 2x2 rib is you're going to see the rib texture more defined, but really it's just a matter of personal preference on what you like better. You can either find this by the yard like you would a regular fabric, or you can also find rib typically what's called tubular knit, which means it's knit in the round, and so there's no start and stop, versus by the yard it's knit back and forth, and so you have the selvage edges just like you would any other fabric. The thing to watch out with tubular knits is they tend to be very narrow, and so if you're doing one of the larger sizes and you want to do the basic bottom band, you may run into issues where the fabric is too narrow for it, in which case you're either going to have to do the 2-piece band or piece it together however you wish. So just keep that in mind. Otherwise, the reason why we use rib is because it has a lot of stretch to it and a lot of elasticity. Elasticity means that it shrinks back up really nicely, so that's how you get those kind of like tighter, nice cuffs. You can substitute jersey for rib if you can't find rib, or you can't find the right color that you want, or you want to upcycle something. You can use regular jersey. Just know that jersey doesn't have as much stretch as the rib does, so you're going to want to alter the pattern and add inches back to all of the bands. If you do just cut the bands as is out of jersey, it's probably going to look really, really tight, versus the rib won't. The rib will lay nicer. The last thing you're going to need is, if you are doing the quilted version, is you're going to want some quilting cotton or fabric scrap. You could also, for the center back panel, you could do a contrast color of the same fabric, or you could upcycle a different fabric of some kind. I am not a quilter. I'm going to do the most basic beginner options, which are the log cabin method and the crumb method, but by all means you could go totally crazy and ham and have so much creative fun. You could do your favorite quilted block. You could do a paper piecing of your pet's name, their initials. You could do a jack-o'-lantern for Halloween, a Christmas tree for Christmas. Do whatever. I have a whole Pinterest board of inspiration which would have links to patterns that you could purchase by other small companies and tutorials for other methods. Yeah, we are going to do 2 different ones today because there's so many different options and this is such a quick sew. I just figure let's cover all of our bases. So I'm gonna make 2 today. I'm gonna make one in the size 12 and I'm gonna use the turtleneck, but I'm going to do the harness opening on that one. I'm going to do the pocket. I'm gonna do the basic hem of the band, and I'm gonna sew it entirely on the sewing machine. So if you do not have a serger, don't fret. I'm gonna show you how to do it. Regular sewing machine all the way through. Oh, and with the 12 on the home machine, I'm gonna show you one sleeve version, which on the smaller sizes, sewing the cuff in the round might get really, really hard to do when it's so tiny. So that's why I'm going to show you an alternate method for the smaller sizes that will be easier to sew. And then for the second one that I'm going to do it on the serger. I'm going to do the hood, which also includes the crew neck, because that helps to keep everything nice and tight around their neck and looks cleaner thinner than just the regular hood. So we're gonna do the hood, which also includes the crew neck. We are going to not do the harness opening on this one, and we're gonna do the 2-piece band that has the elastic. So all the options, and then again, one I'm gonna do the log cabin method, the other one the crumb method. Just feel free to watch one or the other, or skip through to whichever part of the tutorial is what you need. And first I'm gonna show you how to measure the stretch. Let's get started. To determine how much percentage of stretch your fabric has, you're going to take a swatch of it and you're going to align it and measure across 5 inches. Then you're going to pinch at that 5-inch mark and then stretch the fabric as much as you can. In this case, it's stretching to 1.5 inches greater, and then you're going to take that difference of 1.5 inches and divide it by 5, which gives me a 30% stretch in this case. We're going to start by quilting the center back panel. So you basically need to take your fabric scraps and make a quilted panel that is as large or just slightly larger than your center back C panel. The first method that I'm going to do is the log cabin method. So I'm going to cut a couple of 1.5 by 1.5 inch squares and then strips that are also 1.5 inches. You can make these size whatever you want it to be. That's just what I chose for this. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take one of those squares and you're going to align the strip to one of these sides, and you're going to sew with a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. I don't worry about the back stitching on any of this. Then you're going to press your seam allowance open and trim away the excess. Then you're going to rotate your piece 90 degrees, and then you're going to put another strip along that new line, and then again sew with a 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. You're going to press your seams open and then trim the excess and continue on that method around in basically like a spiral motion. So again, rotating 90 degrees and aligning a new strip to that line and sew it together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press it open, trim again, rotate 90 degrees, and then just keep going with this method over and over again with strips. Obviously, as the block continues to grow, the strips will get increasingly longer. Eventually you'll have a square that's big enough, so I then am making 2 more blocks exactly the same, so you end up with 3 that will be big enough. I'm going to stitch those 3 blocks together using 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance again and again. Press them open until you have a block again that's large enough to fit the entirety of your center back C panel, which this now is. So then you're just going to place either your pattern piece or the main body fabric that you've already trimmed out, and then cut the block to match the pattern piece. Then what you're going to do is place the quilted block on top of the main body fabric, and we're going to baste it in place so it doesn't move and it's easier to stitch it together. It is also optional if you want to stitch in the ditch to quilt the block to your panel, which I'm doing here. The log cabin method, the strips are along the grain. However, with the crumb method, they're not, so it might be more apt to do it with the crumb method, but totally optional and up to you. I did find it easier to quilt the block prior to basting it, but again, the quilting is totally optional and up to you. For the crumb method, this is very zero waste friendly. This is your ability to use all of the teeny tiny scraps that your heart desires that you've been saving, and pretty much with the crumb method, you're just going to take a bunch of scraps of different shapes, different sizes, and stitch them together until, again, you have a block that is big enough to fit your back center panel. For me, I have a bunch of tiny scraps left over from my upcoming holiday collection, and literally I designed this and created this on the spot that you see me here. And I just took pieces that I liked putting together and stitched them with 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. Again, I don't care about back stitching, and then you're just going to keep piecing pieces together. You'll notice in this scenario, because you don't have a lot of seams that are necessarily straight. I just sort of created the stitch lines and then cut away the excess seam allowance. And then I just kept playing around with different shapes and different pieces until I created something that I was happy with, and I just kept stitching blocks together. You're going to want to make sure that you are pressing your seam allowance as you go along. But again, I am just creating the blocks and the sizes that I want based on the scraps that I'm using. And I just keep piecing pieces together, then pressing them open and replacing it onto my block as a guide of where I need to fill in, and just kept cutting pieces and picked and choosed. And then sometimes I decided I wanted extra lines places, so then I again cut the block and added an extra piece, pressed it open until I finally had a block that was the complete size. And that's the Crumb method. It's very organic. It was super fun to create this. I loved how it turned out. And then once you're done, you're going to, again, just as you did with the log cabin method, cut the block to the correct size to match your pattern piece. And then we're going to baste it. And again, I would highly recommend with the Crumb method, because the grain lines are all over the place. It might be even more advantageous to stitch in the ditch, which just basically means you're stitching in all of the seam lines. And then I found it easier, again, to quilt it prior to basting it. And you want the basting stitches to be inside the 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance, so you don't have to worry about seeing it when you ultimately seam it together. For the harness opening, we are going to finish the raw edge of the center back seam on the back yoke, and we are going to do this on the sewing machine. So we're going to pick the overlock stitch, which tells you to use the overlock foot, and you're going to align that raw edge with the right side of your overlock foot and just let it do its thing. You don't have to worry about back stitching. You're going to act just like you would with a serger, but it obviously is not a serger. To save time, I like to chain the pieces together, so that means you are not going to cut the thread, you're just going to feed the next piece in and keep sewing, and then you can cut it away after the fact like this. And this is what the Overcast stitch ends up looking like. Next, with right sides together, you're going to sew the center back seam of the back yoke B with 3/4 inch or 1.9 centimeter seam allowance, leaving a 1.5 inch 3.8 centimeter seam opening between the notches. Make sure to backstitch at the start and end of both seams. For added durability, you can choose to apply a small layer of stretch fusible interfacing to the wrong side of the fabric. I do not have any of that on hand, so I will not be doing that, but it will just add durability with the friction that's going to happen from your leash. I like to set the seam by first pressing it closed and then opening it and pressing the seam allowance open. It just helps to loosen the fibers to get a better press. Next, we're going to add a bar tack, which is a tiny zigzag stitch. These are my settings for it, just to the top and bottom of your seam, which again is going to help with the durability. I like to go back and forth a few times, and that's what it looks like when it is complete. Again, doing the top and bottom, it will just help to reinforce those stress points. The total width of each bar tack is about 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter. Once you're finished, go ahead and just clip those loose threads. After that, with right sides together, we're going to overcast stitch the back yoke B to the top edge of the center back panel C with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance, which is the width of the overcast. So you're just going to align the edge with the presser foot as you did with the raw edge, and we're going to do the exact same thing with the back hem D to the bottom of the center back panel C. again with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then you're going to press the seam allowance towards the back yoke B and the bottom hem D. Feel free to add top stitching to any seams that you like. Moving on to the pocket, we're going to do the hems on the pocket openings. And to do that, we're going to first press the curved hems of pocket E to the wrong side of the fabric, 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters. If you are new to knits and you're worried about the fabric moving and shifting on you, you can also use wash away tape like I'm going to show you here. And all that's going to do is it's 1/8 of an inch like tape that is going to stick it so that it won't move on you, and when you wash it the glue will just wash away. We're going to use the lightning stitch on this, which basically looks almost like a straight stitch, but it stretches so you won't worry about it breaking. You can stop here with just one side of stitches. I just happen to like the look of Coverstitch, which is the double stitch, so I'm going to do a second row next to it, but that's totally optional to you. The other option is to, again, do cover stitch, or you can do a faux cover stitch by you serging the raw edge or using the Overcast first and then doing 2 layers of top stitching. I like to give those a quick press. Then we're going to press the sides of the pocket to the wrong side of the fabric, as well as the top edge 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the edge. Just like this. Again, you can use wash away tape to stick your pocket into place, or you can use pins, whichever is easiest for you. I just happen to really love the wash away tape. Center the pocket onto the back panel with the bottom raw edges aligned and matching the center back notch on both the pocket and the back. Once you're happy with it, again, either pin or place it down. On the larger sizes, the top of the pocket will remain on the back hem D only and not cross over onto the center back panel. Then we're going to top stitch the top and sides of the pocket down 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters away from the edge, and on the top edge or the bottom opening of the pocket, we're going to add a small triangle to each side, which will help reinforce it. I like to align the bottom of the triangle to the bottom of the stitching of the pocket. That's kind of my guide right there. And then for the second side, I end up starting with that bottom triangle. So I'm aligning my needle into, again, where that bottom row of top stitching is on my pocket. Back stitch, go up, over, turn your presser foot over, go over a couple of stitches, and then follow that seam down. And then to save myself time, instead of topping and starting, I literally just turn my presser foot to baste the bottom edge. For the narrow sleeve cuff method, I like to attach the cuff to the sleeve prior to attaching it to the body of the garment, in which case you're going to take the sleeve cuff H, you're going to fold it in half widthwise with wrong sides together, and you're going to attach it to the sleeve opening F with 1/4 inch 6 millimeter seam allowance. You're going to want to lightly stretch it to fit. We're going to use the Overcast stitch, so make sure to change your presser foot back to the Overcast. And I like to do a couple of stitches, and then I'm going to pull the rib to meet the end of the opening, and then I just will slowly, as I go, match the ends of raw edges of the cuff to the raw edge of the opening as I go along. But that way it is stretched evenly on both sides, and then you're just going to do the same thing to the other sleeve. Now I attached my sleeve to the body because I was following the instructions at first, so just pretend that it's not attached to the back already, and just, again, you can feed it through like a chain. As opposed to starting and stopping, you're going to treat it almost like you would a serger. And then cut the sleeves apart, and we're going to press the seam allowance towards the sleeve, and giving it press, make sure to use a lot of steam. That will help set it, and then it will look nice and flat. Do the same thing for both sleeves. If you like, you also have the option to top stitch that edge as well. To tell the front from the back of the sleeve, the front will have a single notch and the back will have a double notch. We are going to attach the back of the sleeve to the back of the garment, matching those double notches. And we are going to use a 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance with the Overcast stitch, since we are using our sewing machine. Once you're done, we're going to do the same thing with the other sleeve to the other side of the back. There should be no stretching. The seam should perfectly align. Next, we are going to attach the front A to the front of the sleeve, matching those single notches. Again, same thing, there is 0 ease on this, so they should align perfectly, and you're just going to attach them with the 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance and the Overcast for both sides of the front, just like this. And then once you are done with both sleeves, we can go ahead and press all of those seam allowances. The back seam allowance is going to get pressed towards the back of the garment, and the seam allowance on the front is going to go towards the front of A. So towards center front and center back is how I've always been taught. With right sides together, we are going to close up the seam that goes all the way from the edge of the sleeve cuff all the way to the bottom hem. So we're going to attach the underarm as well as the side seam in this straight shot. As I'm sewing this, I like to focus on one section at a time, so I'll get the cuff together and matching those cuff seams, and then I will move on to the underarm seam and then finally the side seam. For the bottom band, we're going to fold the bottom band in half the opposite way that we did with the sleeve cuff, and with right sides together this time. So the seam of the bottom hem, I with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance. For a more beginner friendly option, you can always do a straight stitch as well. We are going to cut just in the middle without cutting any of the threads, so that you can then fold the seam allowance to each side, opposite sides, so that you remove the bulk, so not all the seam allowance is on top of each other. Next, we're going to find the midpoint from the seam. I happen to mark a notch when I cut mine out on the fold line, but that's okay. If you didn't, you're just going to fold it in half from the seam, and you're going to mark that point with a pin. Then you're going to line up that pin with the initial seam and find the midpoint of that. Again, mark it with a pin, and then do the same thing again to find the last section, which then you're going to have 4 equal points away from each other. If you're doing a larger size, just repeat that process to split it into 1/8 instead to make your life easier. Then you're going to find one of your side seams, doesn't matter which one, on your garment, and you're going to find the midpoint from that side seam that you chose. And then again, splitting the side seam, matching the side seam up with that pin that you just did to find the midpoint again, in which case you are going to have, again, 4 matching points. Just know that with this method, it's not going to align with center front or center back. They're going to be off, and that's okay. Then you're going to insert the bottom band inside the garment and then match those pins up with each other. This will evenly distribute the band around the bottom hem. If you want more of a snatched look where the waistband hugs the front of it, you're going to adjust the waistband so that you're going to pull it more in the front, concentrate that stretch in the front. I like to shift the pin that was on front A to the side seam. Then I'm going to remove the pins that are on the back portion of the band and find the new center for the back band, as well as the midpoints between the side seam and the center back. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the garment of the body. I'm going to match that middle pin to the center back notch and the midpoint between the side seam and the center back on both sides. The majority of the stretch is going to be again in the front A, and then the back will have less stretch. Using the Overcast stitch, attach both layers of the single bottom hem I to the front A and back bottom hem D with 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance, and lightly stretch the band to fit. Fold the turtleneck K in half widthwise with right sides together, same as you did with the bottom hem. With right sides together, we're going to sew that seam with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance using the Overcast stitch. To reduce the bulk, I like to find the midway point and then slash into the seam allowance, but do not touch the stitching, and that allows you to fold the seam allowance in opposite directions to reduce the bulk. I marked my center notch so it's easier to find center front and center back. You're going to place the turtleneck K inside the neck opening of the garment. You can match the seam to whichever your choice, center front or center back. Because my back yoke has a seam, I chose center back just because it made the most sense to me. Then you're going to attach all the layers using the Overcast stitch with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance. All that's left is to give your garment a final press. Definitely use a lot of steam, especially on the rib knit, to help recover its shape if it was stretched out at all during sewing. You can also top stitch any of the seams to have a more finished look and prevent rolling. But that's it, you're done. Let's move on to the second sample and the serger. If you are brand new to a serger and you would like to use the serger for this project but you feel a little intimidated, I'm here to give you some helpful tips. Although I will not go through the threading of the machine just because it will differ machine to machine, make and model, so definitely look in your instructions for it. But for this project, there's going to be, for the sewing of all of the seams together, you're going to do a 4-thread overlock. Personally, it is the one that I use all the time. And then we are also going to do a cover stitch for the hem on the hood as well as the pocket openings on the Kangaroo pocket. You can choose to do a mock cover stitch using your sewing machine or other things, in which case you will only need the 4-thread overlock. I do also have the instructions set up so that we do rethreading. We do the cover stitch for everything that you would need to do the cover stitch on in one shot, because if you're like me, you hate rethreading your serger over and over. So I have set it up strategically so that there is as little rethreading as possible. When you thread your overlock, you definitely want to follow your instructions closely. Just know that the order in which you thread each of the different threads matters. If you end up where something is not going right or one of your thread breaks, you may need to rethread multiple threads, not just the one that broke. So keep that in mind. If you have an issue, when in doubt, literally just start from the beginning. For the different threads, your first one that's furthest to the left is your left needle. This gets threaded into the left needle on your serger. The next one is your right needle. The one after that is your upper looper thread. Then you have your lower looper thread, and the last one is the chain looper. So on the 4-thread overlocker, you're going to do the first 4. You will not thread anything in the right one. When you do the cover stitch, you'll do the 2 needle and the chain. Again, follow the instructions for your particular machine. And again, the threading order versus your sewing machine, the threading order on this matters. The other thing that, if you're new, obviously with 4 threads, you need 4 spools of thread. If you want to save money and not have to purchase 4 spools every time you do a project in the color of your project, cover stitch, obviously the 2 needles will show, but if you're just using the 4-thread overlocker, the only one that is actually going to show in the seams on the outside of your project is that far left. So if you want to just do the color that matches your project on the left needle and then do gray or neutral for the other 3, those you don't have to switch out project to project if you don't want to. Here is an example of what that 4-thread overlocker looks like. Again, I have pink thread on just the one that is going to be, like if you did a straight stitch on your sewing machine, that's effectively what that particular thread is mimicking, and the rest you're not going to see on your project unless you obviously see the inside of the project. But from the outside, you're only going to see that one. So if you want a cost-effective way to save money, and then this is your cover stitch. I'm doing a narrow cover stitch, which means the needles are 1/8 or 3mm apart, and there is a wide cover stitch, which would be about 1/4 inch or 6mm apart. I prefer the narrow. Those are the 2 stitches that we are going to be doing for this project, and I think that's about it. If you have any other questions, drop them in the comments below and I'm happy to answer them. For this sample, I cut the back yoke B on the fold, so there is no harness attachment. We are going to, with right sides together, serge the back yoke B to the top of the center back panel C with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance. I'm setting the seam first before pressing the seam allowance to the back yoke B. Next, with right sides together, we are going to serge the center back panel C to the back hem D with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance. Again, I'm going to set the seam first and then I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the back hem D. Place both hood G panels with right sides together, and then you're going to serge the center back seam with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance. Once you're done, I'm going to first set the seam and then press that seam open. This will be easier with a tailor's ham, however, mine is in storage, so that wasn't happening for me. But it will be much easier. Next, we're going to press the hem of the hood 7/8 of an inch or 2.2 centimeters from the wrong side of the fabric along the fold line. You can measure with a ruler. I also am going to cut a slash into the seam allowance. Do not touch the stitching though, and that's going to allow you to fold the seam allowance in opposite directions to remove the bulk when you do the cover stitch. I also fold in the little tail of the serged threads to have it neat and out of the way. Again, continue pressing the entirety of the hem of the hood, and then we're going to do the cover stitch. However, if you want to fake a cover stitch, you're going to serge the raw edge first before you fold it over. So along the raw edge, just like that, single layer, and then you're going to fold it. And then you can either use 2 rows of straight stitch or you can use a twin needle on your sewing machine, which looks like this. For the cover stitch, the face side of the hood is going to be facing up, so you're kind of going blind, but that's okay. You can feel where the ridge of the seam allowance is, and so I have that just past my left needle, and then it's also lining up with the 3/4 mark on the right side. So I'm using those both and my finger as a guide to feel where that seam allowance is, and you're just going to go all the way across, and it'll look like this on the front side. And then on the back side, if there is any excess seam allowance, just go ahead and trim it away. Set the hood aside for later, and we can go back to rethreading to the 4 thread overlock for the remainder of this project. Find the double notch on one of your sleeve F. This will indicate the back of the sleeve, and you're going to match it to the double notch on the back yoke B. And with right sides together, serge one sleeve to the back, matching those notches with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance. Repeat this same process with the second sleeve. Press the seam allowance towards the back panel for both of the back raglan seams. Find the notch on the raglan seam on front A and match it up with the single notch on your sleeve F. And then with right sides together, serge one side of the front A to the front of the sleeve F with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance, and then repeat that same thing with the second sleeve. Press the seam allowance towards the front A for both of the raglan seams. Match up the raw edges of the sleeve opening as well as the seam at the underarm, and lastly the side seam. With right sides together, you're going to serge from that raw edge all the way down to the end of the side seam with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance, making sure to match that underarm seam. And I like to do it in 2 sections. Basically, I focus on to the seam and then from the seam to the end of the side seam. Repeat on both sides. Fold the sleeve cuff H in half widthwise with right sides together, and then you're going to serge that seam with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance. If you want it more beginner friendly, you can do this on the sewing machine. You're going to repeat the same process for the second sleeve cuff, and I'm also going to do it for the crew neck band, neckband J at the same process, doing the same thing. To reduce seam allowance, you're going to slash the center of the seam allowance only, do not cut any of the stitching, and then you're going to fold the seam allowance in opposite directions, and that helps to reduce the bulk at the seam. With wrong sides together, fold the cuff in half, matching the raw edges and seam. You can see the seam lining up, but the seam allowances are going in opposite directions, and then I pin that in place. To find the midpoint from that seam, just fold it in half and then mark that with a pin. Then match the pin to the seam and find the midway points between each of those, and again mark with a pin. I'm just going to trim some of that seam allowance. You're going to do the same thing with the sleeve opening of the sleeve F, using the underarm seam as one of your 4 points. With right sides together, place the cuff inside of the sleeve opening, matching the raw edges and the sleeve cuff seam to the underarm seam, and then you're going to match the remaining 3 pins as well. Serge both layers of the sleeve cuff to the sleeve opening with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance, lightly stretching the cuff to fit. As well, make sure that you leave a tail long enough of the serge thread to weave in later, and then repeat the process for both sleeves. For the elastic 2-piece hem, there's a front and a back band. You're going to first cut a piece of elastic the same length as the front hem band L. Disregard that mine is ribbed, it's just what I had on hand. And for the width of the elastic that you need, refer to the notions page in the instructions, because it differs per size. The right sides together align one side edge of the front hem band L and back band M. Place the elastic on the top of the wrong side of the front hem, matching the bottom edge of the elastic to the center notch. Serge the layers together with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance, and then we're going to repeat the same thing on the other side. Slash the center of the seam allowance just below the elastic. This allows you, again, to reduce the bulk as we did with the sleeve cuffs. And you're going to do that for both seams, and then fold it up so that the elastic is encased inside, and then I just pinned it in place. To make it easier to attach it to the hem of the garment, I'm finding the center front and center back. I had a notch for mine when I cut mine out, but if you don't, you can find it the same way we've been doing the rest of it. Then you're going to, with right sides together, place the bottom 2-piece band inside the bottom opening of the garment, matching the raw edges and the seams, as well as the center of the back hem M to the notch of the center back hem D, and the center front of the band hem L to the center front. To make it easier, I'm adding additional pins on the back of the band by finding the center point between the side seam and center back on both the band M and the hem of the garment, and then serge all the layers together using 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance. Again, you're going to leave a tail long enough that you can weave in later. Because I don't have a back yoke seam, I made sure to have a notch at center back, and I'm adding one to center front as well to make it easier to attach the hood. With right sides together, place the hood G into the neck opening, match the center back seam of the back yoke B, or in this case the notch, to the center back seam of the hood, and you're going to match the notch at the back raglan seam and the center front hood to the center front of notch A. If it doesn't quite meet at center front, that is okay. Then you're going to baste it with less than 1/4 inch or 6mm seam allowance using a straight stitch on your machine to make your life easier. If you recall, I sewed the neckband J, that seam, when we did the sleeve cuffs, but you're going to again slash the center of it and put the seam allowance to both sides to reduce the bulk the same way that you did with the sleeve cuffs. We are also going to again do the same thing with finding the midpoint from that seam as well as the midpoints from both of those points. We're going to do the same thing on the neck band using your choice of either one front raglan or back raglan sleeve to match the seam of the neckband too. With right sides together, place the neckband J inside the neck of the garment, matching the raw edges and the seam of the band to whichever raglan seam that you already chose. You're going to match the other 3 pins, and then you're going to serge the layers together with 1/4 inch 6mm seam allowance, lightly stretching the band to fit. Make sure to leave a tail long enough to weave in later. Now we are ready to weave in those threads. I like to use a loop turner, but you can also use a hand sewing needle. For the loop turning method, you're going to push the loop turner through the threads of the serged edge, and then out. Once you get to where that is, you're going to loop the chain that you have and then pull it through about, I'd say, an inch or so, and then just trim the excess and you're done. If you're using a needle, you would do the opposite. You would thread the chain through the eye of the needle and then push the needle through the row of stitches for about an inch or so and then trim the excess. Then all that's left to do is give it a final press. Steam is your best friend to help lay those flat. You can also top stitch if you want to prevent the seams like the bottom hem from rolling. Congratulations, you just finished your Kaleido hoodie. I hope you and your pup or cat love how it turned out. Please don't forget to share and use hashtag Kaleido Hoodie and tag me on Instagram at Hudson Houndstooth. Literally nothing brings me more joy than seeing what you guys create. I just want to say a final huge shout out. Thank you to my pattern testers who made multiple versions of this hoodie. They helped me perfect the fit and inspired me with their creativity on all the different options and ideas that they had for making this Kaleido hoodie what it is. I am so grateful because I truly could not have put this pattern together without you. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like this video and subscribe for future tutorials, as well as check out all the other patterns that are available already. Until next time, thank you so much for watching and happy sewing!